Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Pete Ricketts for a conversation moderated by Jenilee Keefe, Senior Director for Government Affairs at SCSP.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at this last session of the day on this stage. I am here to welcome you to winning the AI race with the CCP, a conversation with U.S. Senator Pete Ricketts. As you heard, I'm Jenilee Keefe. I'm a Senior Director for Government Affairs at SCSP, and I'm here to moderate this dynamic conversation with Senator Ricketts of Nebraska. I wanted to give you a little background on the senator to understand his expertise here. He's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Banking and Environment and Public Works Committees. And he is a leading voice in U.S. policy toward China, global trade, and strategic technologies. Notably, he serves as chair and on the SFRC Subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and Cybersecurity, which you could probably tell by the title, oversees all matters concerning U.S. relations with East Asia and the Pacific. So he brings here today a sharp and critical understanding and focus on strengthening America's economic resilience and competitive edge. So I want you all to once again welcome the senator here to the stage.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, Senator, I'd love to jump right in and start with talking about the AI diffusion rule. You wrote a letter to the U.S. Department of Commerce, and you called on the department to rescind the rule. DOC heeded your call, rescinded the rule. So now as the Trump administration considers new policy, what are major opportunities you expect to see in the AI space?
Yeah, let's take a step back to that Biden rule. It was put in literally on January 15th. So obviously that was less than a week before the Trump administration was going to be sworn in. So this is what you kind of call one of those midnight rules. And it was trying to address a legitimate issue with regard to how do we prevent China from being able to get access to our technology, our chips, everything like that with regard to AI, because it's incredibly important that we remain a leader in AI. But ironically, that rule would have had the opposite effect. It would have driven our allies to use the Chinese stack because that's the way the rules were written. So there were three tiers actually. In the first tier, it was only 18 countries who would be able to get access to our technology and so forth, but they would have to jump through a whole set of regulatory burdens, rules, stuff like that. So it really put a lot of restraints on how they could actually, in the real world, use it because of all the restrictions. Then in the second tier were a bunch of our other allies, like Israel, that would be limited in what they would be able to buy from us and what they'd be able to use. And then finally, in the third tier was places like Communist China, which are already restricted, so it was already something that was going to be limiting. And the key thing to remember here is this competition is about innovation and adoption. So that's a key thing for everybody to take away, innovation and adoption. And what this Biden-era AI diffusion rule would have done is really strangled both the innovation from outside the United States and the adoption outside the United States. It would have forced companies to go to China to start using their, technology, whether it's their applications or their platform, to be able to do that, and that would have had the opposite effect. So on May 13th, the Trump administration rescinded the rule just 2 days before it was supposed to go into effect. The problem was it was going to create a lot of uncertainty, would have held up the types of investments we need to do as people were going through the innovation. So it was very good that the Trump administration rolled that back. So that's a key thing. And so you say, well, what are we going to do now? Well, obviously we need to continue to do some of the things we've been doing, like trying to restrict what China can do as far as getting access to our high-end chips and so forth. And there's rules in place for that. And we need to think about how we're going to do a better job on that. Since 2019, the United States has been putting pressure on countries like the Netherlands so that like SML won't export their advanced lithography machines to China. That's a good thing to do. And I'm sure the Trump administration is going to be thinking about other things about this. David Sachs came and presented to us. He didn't give any specifics, but they're talking about some of the things, so we'll see. But I'll tell you the thing we cannot do. We cannot become Europe. Okay, so Europe is basically killed off the innovation, not just in this, but in particular AI, through the regulatory scheme, right? They've got over 100 tech-related laws, 270 regulatory organizations. They passed laws like the EU AI Act, or the Digital Market Act, or the Digital Services Act, or their General Data Protection Regulation. All these things create this regulatory wet blanket on their innovation that has really stifled it. You know, you think about Europe, they've got about 15% of the world's GDP, and yet if you look at the top Fortune 500 companies, or 50 companies, they got 4. So they're not getting it done, and in fact, even Europeans recognize this, right? The CEO of Ericsson said, Europe's in danger of becoming a museum. The CEO of Nokia said that they've got 1 foot in the morgue, and that Europe's GDP is 30% below the United States, and the number of Fortune 500 companies is falling. And think about that, right? There's 449 million people in the EU. The United States is about 340 million, and yet we've got a bigger GDP. We got more of these companies. We've got more of the innovation. So their regulatory scheme has really, really hampered their ability to go places. In fact, the head of the Norway's sovereign fund has basically said the same thing. This regulatory scheme has really stifled their innovation. In fact, what he said, I think the quote was, we have no AI and a lot of regulations, right? So that's what we cannot become. And I fear this AI diffusion rule from the Biden administration would have led us down that path of becoming like Europe. Mm-hmm. We've got to allow that innovation if we're going to compete with China. That's one of the things that we got to do. And just the other thing that we got to recognize is that China has a lot of critical mass here, right? They have got a very big country with a lot of engineers. So we've got to be able to figure out ways to compete against that. And that's what we have to think about when we're doing this.
I think that's really interesting. A few things you said lead me to some other questions here. So what?
No, you got to answer the ones that I practiced the ones you got on here.
No. But you got me to think.
Oh, sorry.
I know. I got to use the brain, right? So you were talking about, propelling U.S. innovation, not taking the path of Europe. So what are some things that we should prioritize here in the United States to really push innovation forward?
Well, the first thing we got to do is we got to get our own environment, our economy, our ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, in order, right? So think about this. We got $36 trillion in debt, right? We got to get that under control. We're looking at a reconciliation bill right now in front of Congress that's looking at doing things like making R&D tax credits, the capital expenditures, all these things that be tax credits that are currently expiring. The House has made it so they're extended, but in the Senate, our intention is to make those permanent, because permanence is certainty, and that will help companies in the United States know they can invest and do investments for the long term that will help us compete. So that's one of the things we got to do to be able to be competitive and get our house in order. So that's part of it, is get that right. And then, get the regulatory scheme right, which means not over-regulating like we have. Mm-hmm. And then I'll go off on a little bit of a tangent here, too, because we talked about one of the key things we got to do is think about, again, that critical mass that China has. They're huge, right? We got to leverage what our strengths are. Now, one of our strengths that China doesn't have is we've got friends. We've got allies and partners outside the United States that we need to bring onto our side to help us leverage this. So, for example, what just happened with Stargate UAE is a great example of that, right? Where you've got OpenAI going to them. They're going to create, it's part of a 5 gigawatt data center. They're going to start with one. I think 200 are going to be, megawatts are going to be online by next year. And the idea is to create a platform there so that we can start getting, I guess the UAE is actually give OpenAI to all their or ChatGPT to all their folks, right? So they're going to be actually rolling this out, and the UAE is going to invest anywhere between $8 and $10 billion in this. They're going to invest not only creating this one in the UAE, but they're going to also invest in the United States. So that's a way that we can start leveraging the scale to start competing with China on that level. Mm-hmm. And that will complement what we're doing with Stargate here in the United States. So thinking about that's one of the ways, again, thinking outside the box about how we can compete, get our own house in order, don't become like Europe, but then figure out how we can leverage our friends to be able to get the kind of scale that China's got the potential to do so we can stay ahead of them.
That all makes sense to me.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah, that's good. So talking about China a little bit, China has been making a lot of leaps lately. How do you think China will overtake the United States in this competition?
Well, that's what the competition's about. Will China overtake us? Right now, we're still in the lead. So if you go out and look at like the number, I think the United States has created 40 platforms. China's created like 15. So we're still in the lead there with regard to like the technology and how it's advancing. But this is why, we can't rest on our laurels. First of all, China's stealing our technology, which is kind of an indicator that they're still trying to get stuff from us. But the DeepSeek, application really demonstrates that they are being innovative as well, right? And that's one of the things, that there's more than one way to solve some of these problems. And we've been trying to keep our high-end chips out of China, and we should. But what that means is that's forcing them to think about solving the same kind of problems, only they're going to do it in different ways, which is obviously what they did with DeepSeek, right? So we can't think that just because we're going to keep high-end chips out of China, somehow China's not going to keep up with us. That's just that we want to slow them down, but they're still going to innovate. Again, they've got the scale we talked about, so they're still going to be trying to beat us in this. And it's really important we win. Because if we don't win, if we don't stay ahead of them, and the world starts adapting China's stack, that means, for example, we'll be using Chinese applications, which means all your data is now going to be controlled by China, right? They will be the ones who are leading the innovation when it comes to things like pharmaceuticals or agriculture or defense. They will be the ones leading all that. And that puts us at a huge disadvantage. Not only will Americans' privacy be at risk, but our very way of life. Because if we can't be the innovation in these other areas where AI is going to be so important, we're going to be dependent on China for all these things. So that's why this competition is so important. We've got to be able to continue to innovate and beat them and stay ahead of them to be able to, we actually can't beat them, we just got to stay ahead of them because this is a competition. We got to just stay ahead of them, and that's why we can't do what Europe's done that's really strangling off that innovation and that adoption that's so important.
You mentioned a little bit what it would be like if China is ahead or China wins. How do you see the United States 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if we're the ones who stay ahead? What do we gain?
Well, what we gain is the fact that we actually are in control of our own destinies. One of the things that AI has a huge potential for is making us much more efficient. So, for example, there's this guy, Dr. Bryn Joel Olson, who is at Stanford and just has been analyzing companies that adopt AI. And just within the first few months, they see a 14% increase in productivity. And actually, the interesting thing is, when you look at people who are lower skilled, it's actually more, which is actually really good news for people who just have like a high school degree, because that means that they have the potential to really increase their earnings even more than somebody who's maybe got a college degree or a master's degree. So, but let's just take what he's got there, which is the first few months, that's a 14% increase. That means that we will stay ahead in productivity here in the United States. That means we'll be able to set our own destiny with regard to how we're doing things like pharmaceutical research or agricultural research or defense technology research, so that we can continue to be able to innovate like we have done over these many years where the United States has been dominant. And again, we can see the problem is if you don't, because you can look at the example of Europe and say, that's the problem, right? What kind of tech innovations have come out of Europe? What kind of innovations at all have come out of Europe, right? Look at the innovations. It's all come from the United States. Really, maybe not all. Maybe that's a little bit of hyperbole. I am a U.S. senator. I can be a little bit hyperbole about our country, right? But primarily it is coming from us. So that's what's at risk here. If we don't stay ahead, we're going to be beholden for China. And if we do stay ahead, we'll continue to see the innovation and adoption coming from the United States. And then the rest of the world will follow us. And that's not only good for us, that's good for the rest of the world. Because, I mean, you can just look at some of the stuff that China does when they're in charge. Like, go ask DeepSeek about Tiananmen Square. See if you get a straight answer on that one, right? You're not. Why? Because they censor. So if they're in charge of the stack, they're going to censor their enemies, and that means us. So you're not going to be able to get the right information or true information about what's going on in the world or what real answers are. You won't know. You won't be able to believe what you're actually seeing because you know they censor.
That's fair. I want to pivot a little bit. I know that you recently went to Taiwan at a pivotal moment in U.S.-China relations. I'd love to know what were your key takeaways from that trip? What is the importance of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and how do you assess Taiwan's current posture in defending coercive behavior from China?
So we talked about one of the things what are one of the things we need to do to make sure that we continue to stay late, because that was your last question, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to bridge.
Thank you. I love that. This is going to be really good. Let's build a bridge.
So we're going to bridge from that last question and say one of the things that we have to do to be able to stay in the lead here is not let communist China take over Taiwan. This is really important because TSMC makes like 90% of all these really high-end chips. Taiwan's in a really interesting position because the two big superpowers in the world, us and China, both depend on them for these chips. So that's a big deal. And if you look by 2030, just a lot of the chips in general, I think like 37% are going to come from Taiwan, 38% are going to be made in China. So we have to make sure China does not take Taiwan by force or coercion. So I, in April, led a CODEL, or congressional delegation, with Chris Coons, who's the second-ranking Democrat on foreign relations. And we took Ted Budd with us as well, Senator from North Carolina. And we went to the Philippines and Taiwan, and we saw the aggressive nature of what communist China is doing. For example, they're infringing upon the Philippines' exclusive economic zone and really being bullies. They've got their Navy, their Coast Guard, they've got these maritime militia that are intimidating, say, Filipino fishing vessels to try and get them out of their own exclusive economic zone, and trying to take over islands that are actually Philippines, right? So they're trying to expand their footprint there. We've seen a lot of military action around Taiwan, which is really leading toward a rehearsal for invading Taiwan. So we need to be able to make sure we're deterring that every day. Now, the good news is, while we were there, we saw with the new Lai administration, President Lai's the new administration, we met with him, we met with Vice President Xiao, we met with their defense minister, we met with some military officials. Taiwan is serious about preparing to hold off an invasion. And they're serious about trying to counter the coercion. So they're doing the planning. So we asked them, like, what's your will to fight? They're like, well, I don't know if we can tell you the will to fight until the moment comes, but we do have the will to plan. And this is really, they've really kind of come 180 degrees just in the last year. So it's really now a race against time. But they are taking steps to do things like make a serious reserve force. They want to say, take 20% of all the people that are generally have to be conscripted, and they want to buy rifles and flak vests and helmets and night vision goggles and all that, night scopes and stuff like that. So they are serious about creating a reserve force. Well, why is that important? Because as Xi Jinping is looking at taking Taiwan, he wants this as part of his legacy. He's very serious about it, right? He's told his military to be capable of taking Taiwan by 2027. Xi Jinping is 72. Is he going to be there 5 years? Yeah, 10 years, probably. 15 years, maybe. 20 years, not probably. So we got a window of like 5 to 15 years when he probably tries to do this. But he also knows that if he tries and fails, it's an existential threat to him. Because if he tries and fails, either he will be killed or he'll be put in prison the rest of his life. So we got to keep convincing him that the rules on the ground have changed, and he's got to rethink his planning. This reserve force is one of the ways that he will have to recalculate, because it doesn't exist today. So now he's going to have to think, okay, if I invade and I got this reserve force, what does that mean? That's going to push it off into the future a little bit more. So that's what we have to do, is keep thinking about how can we keep changing the rules. So we have to keep thinking about pushing this off. So some of the things that we can do, for example, is I've introduced the Porcupine Act. So this is about basically making Taiwan, you like that? Oh, I saw somebody smiling. Okay, so Porcupine Act. My team worked really hard to come up with that one, just so you know. That's providing our regional companions upgraded protection in nefarious environments.
Do they get a bonus for that one?
They're totally get a bonus for that one. That's really good,
That
isn't
is beyond.
That is stretching it.
It's a good one.
So anyway, but what that is taking Taiwan and making them a NATO plus ally so that we can cut the time on congressional notifications, can cut the time to get them this stuff. We're like $21 or $22 billion behind on delivering weapons to them. So we got to do our part here too. So we got to start delivering on that. We also want to work with like TSMC. They promised to invest like $100 billion in this country. But it's not just about TSMC. We want that whole ecosystem of companies that support TSMC in making these chips. Well, one of the things that we've got right now is double taxation with Taiwan. So we need to be able to get rid of that. So Mike Crapo, and I'm a co-sponsor of this, has introduced the U.S.-Taiwan Expedited Double Tax Relief Act to be able to get rid of that double taxation. And this was something when, like for example, when we sat down with Vice President Xiao, she specifically mentioned as a problem for that investment of Taiwanese companies into the United States. So, but again, trying to make sure that we're doing a good job with that relationship back and forth is how we can keep deterring Communist China and Xi Jinping in particular from trying to take Taiwan by force or trying to coerce it. One of the other things that we did is we did a tabletop exercise, bipartisan. I think we had about a half a dozen senators, equally from both Republicans and Democrats, about China trying to do a coercion around energy. And so we came up with some ideas on what we can do there to be able to deter that. And so, for example, if anybody's old enough to remember Reagan, back in the 1980s, we had a problem with the Iranian Navy, and tanker ships didn't want to go in there. So he not only provided protection, but then did some stuff around insurance to be able to make sure ships would still sail there, because insurance is actually a really big deal. If you can't insure a ship, that ship is not sailing to where your destination is going. So we think there's ideas around how can the U.S. Navy protect some of these ships that are not U.S. flagged, and how can we provide the insurance? It's not an easy question to solve, but those are some other things that if we do those things, that's another thing that Xi Jinping's got to go. It's like, oh, well, if I try to do an energy quarantine and the U.S. Navy escorts those ships that are not U.S. flagged, what does that mean? So he's got to go back and replan again. And what if I can't cut off their insurance? Oh, now I go back and replan again. So that everything we do that changes the rules from where we are today makes the PLA Navy, Xi Jinping replan. That takes time to do, and that pushes off that date from when they try to do it.
Yep. How important is it for us to build stronger tech alliances to help both deter China in this aggression, but also to ensure our tech lead?
Yeah, so that gets back to some of the things we talked about, like with G42, this whole thing with the UAE and Stargate UAE, is we need to go out and do that not only with the UAE, which is great that they're investing this kind of dollars, but we need to find other allies that want to do that too, right, in other parts of the world. And again, getting back to innovation and adoption, if we get other countries to adopt our stack, for example, NVIDIA chips don't work with Huawei, right? So the more they adopt our stuff and are using our technology, the less they're going to go over to the Chinese companies, and that's good for us. And that's good for keeping it free, because I don't think anybody wants to live in a world where the Chinese Communist Party is dictating what we can see, hear, read, all that sort of stuff.
Digging a little more on that, supply chain's really important. How do we ensure that U.S. supply chain is bolstered and we can work with allies and partners to have friendly supply chain? Yeah,
well, again, I think that just gets back to making sure we've got a regulatory regime that inspires people to invest with us, but also making sure that we've got relationships with those countries to be able to make those investments, like what President Trump just did with Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of UAE, is develop those relationships and then get that investment going back and forth so that we can really, again, get that critical mass, that critical size that China's already got. We got to develop that with our partners.
Yep. Let's turn this domestic for a second, really domestic. You served as a governor. Now that you've been a senator and a governor, how do you see states and the federal government working together to ensure tech development here, that it's local, that it is distributed all across the country?
As governor, one of the things I would always say is, hey, I just want the federal government to support me and kind of stay out of the way. And that's really, as the federal government, what we should be thinking about. Let's create the environment. I remember I said some of the things were like, hey, let's get our fiscal house in order. Let's make sure that we're making permanent some of these things that are going to be important for businesses, like the R&D tax credit, so that they can invest long term and know that that tax credit will be there, so they feel confident about that, so that we can get that investment and keep that innovation going. When it comes to actually seeing companies site someplace, whether it's broadly the United States or a specific state, one of the things as governor I learned is nobody invests in a generic place called the United States or a generic state like Nebraska. Companies only invest in specific communities that are welcoming. That means whether you've got the workforce available, the housing available, the regulatory regime, the tax climate, all those things play into it. And one of the wonderful things about our system is we've got 50 states that compete against each other and have different sorts of competitive advantages to be able to do that. So, for example, in Nebraska, we've got low electricity rates. Making sure we got enough electricity is going to be an important thing to do, right?
Absolutely.
Electricity demands, I think, forecast to go from like 2.8% increase to like 8-point-something% increase. So that means permitting reform at the federal level, the things that we've done, like the Restart Act to be able to do permitting reform, or the Spur Act to do energy development, or we did the Advance Act on nuclear energy. Those are all things we didn't, either the Advance Act is actually passed. We did pass that in the Biden administration. The others we introduced in Environment and Public Works. So again, the federal government, making the environment right so we can create that energy. But in Nebraska, we had cheap electricity rates, so we got a lot of the data centers to come to Nebraska. So whether you're talking about Google or Meta or PayPal or Fidelity or Travelers, Yahoo, so we attracted them because we created all those things together with regard to workforce and housing and regulatory environment and tax regime, so that those companies would want to invest, and because we had low-cost utilities. And actually one of the things that for Google was really important is we said, hey, we'll guarantee you 100% renewable energy. And then Omaha Public Power District went out and built a big 400 megawatt or a gigawatt megawatt wind farm. So that's how, again, as states, we'll go out and compete for this and be able to attract those companies and those investments to our state. We need the federal government to create the framework that applies to the entire country and let us go out and compete in those very local areas, because the federal government can't do that, right? They shouldn't pick winners and losers anyway. Let the states go out, and the states and the local communities go out and do it, and that's where governors and mayors and chambers of commerce and that kind of thing come into play to be able to make the competitive case for these companies. They should be investing and creating jobs in our various states.
When you're back in Nebraska and you have constituents come up to you and they're like, Senator, why are you talking about your travel abroad, or why are you talking about AI? Why does this matter to me? I'm trying to help my family. What do you have to say to them for that?
Yeah, so if you go look at things like, what if Communist China takes over Taiwan and disrupts all the trade traffic through the South China Sea?
Yep.
Well, that's like 20% of all the world's trade, right?
Exactly.
So that, and Korea, South Korea, and Japan are two of our biggest trading partners for the state of Nebraska.
Yeah.
So that means we're not going to have access to those markets, which means we won't be able to sell our products there, so that's bad for our farmers and ranchers, and agriculture is our #1 industry. We won't be able to buy stuff, so a lot of the products that are coming from Asia won't be able to get to us. That's going to drive up prices for people at home.
Yep.
So it's going to hit Nebraskans in their pocketbook and harm our #1 industry if Communist China disrupts that trade that's going through the South China Sea. So that's one example. And then we already talked about, on the AI front, if we're all using Chinese data, if we're using their applications, their platform, and who knows, maybe even their infrastructure, then we're not going to get this, the quality of life. Our very way of life is at risk, right? Because then you're never going to be able to trust what you're being told. The research will be done someplace else. We won't see the benefit. We may not even be able to defend ourselves, right? So that will materially impact the lives of everyday Nebraskans. So that's really why this is so important.
Absolutely. So we've talked about a few things here today: strategic competition, policies that can help us win, why it matters to everyone. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share?
Just that, getting back to one of your points, it's really important, I think, that everybody knows there's no winning in this. There's just only continuing to compete. So we're going to have to continue to be innovative and just, that's why there's not one specific policy we can do and say, oh, this is going to fix all of our problems. What we got to do is create the environment so American innovators are the ones who continue to innovate, and that we don't put up rules for people to be adopting what we're doing. I'll just end with this. Back during the Cold War, there's an apocryphal story about Milton Friedman talking to Ronald Reagan. And he supposedly said, hey, either we're right or they're right. Meaning either our system of free enterprise is right or the communist model is right. Now, in the case of the Soviet Union, it was demonstrated that the communist model was wrong. They tried to, for example, to develop semiconductors. They created a whole city around trying to do it, and they failed. Our innovation worked. Communist China is a different story. It's not the Soviet Union. It's a much bigger economy, a lot more people. But either we're right or they're right. Either their centralized system, where they're directing it through state-owned enterprises and so forth, is the right way, or ours is. I believe ours is, and that's why we have to unleash that power of free enterprise and get that critical mass with our friends who believe likewise to be able to compete.
Thank you, Senator. I'm voting for sticking with a democracy.
Yeah, there we
I'd
go.
like to
Good.
do that
Me
as
too.
well.
I like that one too.
I want to thank you so much for your time today. This was a really incredible conversation, and I hope we have you come back to talk about this a little bit more. I'd like everyone to thank the Senator for joining us.
Yep.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much for being here today. Senator Todd Young's got another talk going on the same time as this, and I hope we had more people here. So,
Yeah.
not that we're competitive at all.
Certainly a livelier crowd here. There we go. Thank you so much.